She laughed when the light turned on, and then whispered something that made my heart stop. The funny thing is, I never planned to end up in her house that evening. It started with a simple message. "Hey, the light in the hallway keeps flickering. Do you know anything about that stuff?" She could have called an electrician, but she called me. Her house wasn't just a house. It had this quiet warmth to it, like it had stories stitched into the walls. I'd been inside before. Quick hellos, borrowed tools, a neighborly wave at the door. But this time felt different. Maybe it was the soft glow spilling out from the kitchen, or maybe it was the way she looked at me when I stepped inside, as if she'd been waiting for me. She stood there in that loose, cream-colored sweater that fell just past her hips, her hair loosely tied back, a few strands framing her face. She had that kind of beauty that didn't need announcing, the kind you noticed in the way she carried herself, in the calm beneath her smile. I slipped off my shoes by the door, a quiet habit she'd taught me once. She laughed lightly and said, "It's just the hallway light. It's been driving me crazy." I nodded, pretending to focus on the faulty switch, but my heart was strangely loud in my chest. I climbed the small wooden step stool, and she moved closer, close enough that her perfume, warm vanilla and something faintly floral, wrapped around me like a quiet hug. She handed me the screwdriver with steady hands, but when her fingers brushed mine, a small spark moved between us. Not dramatic, just a soft electric awareness. Her voice was warm, teasing but gentle. "Careful," she said, looking up at me. "You're dealing with dangerous things." I laughed softly. "You mean the wires, or you standing too close?" She raised a brow, that subtle, playful kind of confidence older women wear like silk. "Maybe both." I swallowed, refocusing on the switch, though every sense I had was anchored on her. The flickering light above cast soft, uneven shadows across the hallway, catching the curve of her cheekbone, the light in her eyes. The moment was ordinary, but it didn't feel ordinary. It felt like something was shifting, like the air between us was learning a new language neither of us had spoken yet. She tilted her head slightly, watching me work, her arms folded loosely across her chest. It wasn't the kind of stare that made you nervous, it was the kind that noticed, the kind that made the world outside her hallway disappear. And then, as I loosened the old screw, I realized this was the first time I'd ever stood this close to her without the excuse of passing by. The first time I truly saw her, not just as a familiar face, but as someone who made the edges of my world feel softer. It was just a broken light switch, just another evening. But in that quiet, something small and dangerous flickered on and stayed lit. Should have been a quick fix. A loose wire, a few turns of a screwdriver, and I'd be out the door. But nothing about that night went the way it should have. The stubborn wire wouldn't stay in place, slipping out of my grip again and again. I muttered something under my breath, half frustration, half nerves. She stepped forward without hesitation, her voice soft but certain. "Here," she said. "Let me hold the light for you." She lifted the small flashlight from the counter, standing just behind me. Her presence wasn't loud. It was quiet, steady, but it filled the hallway like warm air. She angled the beam upward, and suddenly everything was clearer. Her breath brushed lightly against the side of my neck, warm against the cool air. "Better?" she whispered. "Yeah," I managed, my voice catching a little more than I liked. She was close. Close enough that I could feel the heat radiating from her body through the thin space between us. Close enough that every inhale felt shared. I focused on the wire in my hand, trying to ignore the way my skin tingled from the nearness of her. As I reached to tighten the connection, my knuckles brushed against hers. Just a fleeting touch, but it felt bigger than it should have. She didn't pull away. In fact, she stayed exactly where she was, steady and calm, like she was aware of what just happened. And she was fine with it. The house was silent except for the click of the screwdriver and the sound of us breathing. That kind of quiet that doesn't feel empty, it feels alive. She shifted slightly to get a better angle with the flashlight, and her shoulder brushed my arm. It wasn't planned. None of it was. But in that tiny movement, something invisible hummed between us. "Almost done?" she asked gently. Her voice carried warmth. It wasn't the kind of question people ask just to fill silence. It had something softer in it, something aware. Almost, I replied, my throat dry. I glanced down, just for a second, and saw her looking up at me. The beam of light reflected softly in her eyes, making them seem brighter, deeper. There was no forced flirtation, no practiced charm. Just something unspoken, resting between us like a fragile secret. I returned to the wires, pretending to focus, but I wasn't really fixing a switch anymore. I was standing inches away from a woman who made the air feel warmer, heavier, and I was trying not to let it show. She laughed softly when I fumbled the screwdriver, the sound quiet and warm. Nervous? She teased. Just concentrating, I said, trying to sound casual. But the truth was, I'd never been more aware of another person's closeness. Not like this, not this quietly. Her fingers brushed mine again when she adjusted the flashlight. This time it lingered a heartbeat longer, just long enough to make me wonder if she felt it too. This slow, quiet pull neither of us had planned for. And right then, in the silence of a hallway, with nothing more than a flickering light between us, something shifted. The moment the wires finally clicked into place, the hallway filled with a soft, sure glow. It wasn't blinding, just warm, like the kind of light that feels more like a touch than a flick of a switch. I flipped the panel shut, climbed down from the stool, and turned to her with a quiet, satisfied grin. There, I said, brushing my palms together. Fixed. She tilted her head slightly, eyes narrowing in that way that meant she was amused but pretending not to be. Then she lifted her chin toward the light. Well, look at that. There was something different about her smile now. Less polite, more alive. I followed her gaze upward, but the truth was, I could feel her looking at me more than I was looking at anything else. The light above us cast a golden halo down her shoulders, softening the lines of her face, picking up the subtle shimmer in her hair. It made her seem both untouchable and incredibly close at the same time. Then she said it, quiet, playful, just enough to make my heart stumble over itself. You turned it on, she murmured. And then, after the briefest pause, she met my eyes and added with a teasing edge, and maybe me too. I laughed. Not because it was funny, but because I didn't know what else to do with the heat crawling up my neck. She smiled wider at my reaction, and in that single glance, there was something dangerous and soft all at once. She wasn't saying it like a line. She wasn't performing. She was just being honest in the kind of way that sneaks under your skin without asking permission. Your trouble, I managed, trying to sound light. She leaned against the doorframe, arms folded loosely over her chest. You're the one who showed up with tools, she countered. Her voice was calm, smooth, but there was that little tremor underneath, the kind that isn't nerves, it's awareness. The light wrapped around us, making everything smaller. The space between her and me suddenly felt like a question mark. A breath too close. She pushed herself gently off the doorframe, walked closer. Not too close, but close enough that the sound of her steps echoed softly in my chest. You really have no idea, do you? She whispered, almost to herself. I tilted my head. Idea about what? About the way you look at people, she said. Like you're not even trying. It's disarming. For a moment, I forgot to breathe. She wasn't flirting just to be playful anymore. She was letting me see something real. She turned away just slightly, as if giving both of us space to step back. But the air didn't let go of what she'd said. I stood there in the glow of a light I'd just fixed, realizing the room wasn't the only thing that had come alive. Sometimes it only takes one line, one teasing half-smile, and a hallway that suddenly feels too small. After that line, and maybe me too, the air between us didn't go back to normal. It didn't break or shift dramatically. It just changed. Softer, warmer, heavier in the quietest way. She laughed softly, a sound that didn't belong to the hallway anymore. Come on, she said, nodding toward the kitchen. You've earned a drink at least. It's the least I can do. I followed her down the short hallway, my heartbeat oddly aware of each step. Her house smelled like something baked earlier in the day, vanilla, cinnamon maybe, a scent that clung to the walls like memory. The kitchen was softly lit, only one warm bulb above the sink. The countertops had that lived-in neatness, clean but personal. A half-open book on the counter. A pair of reading glasses resting beside it. A mug with a faint lipstick mark. She moved around the kitchen with an ease that made everything she did feel unhurried. Her sweater fell loosely along her shoulders, the fabric catching the light every time she turned. She opened a cabinet, grabbed 2 glasses, and glanced over her shoulder with a small smile. "Still take yours without sugar?" It took me a second to realize she'd remembered something I'd said months ago, one random afternoon. "Yeah," I said, almost too softly. She poured us both something to drink. Not fancy, just simple. Real. She slid my glass across the counter. Our fingers brushed again, and this time I didn't flinch away. We sat on opposite sides of the counter, not directly facing each other but close enough that if either of us leaned just slightly, the distance would disappear. It was strange. We were talking about everything except what was sitting in the air between us. "How's work?" she asked. I laughed quietly. "Same as always. Nothing special." She tilted her head, her chin resting on her hand as she watched me. "I like the way you say that," she said softly. "Like you're trying to convince yourself of it." That disarmed me more than I expected. Her words weren't loud, but they landed. Like she'd noticed something no one else had bothered to see. She took a slow sip, her eyes never really leaving mine. And in that stillness, I became hyper-aware of the small things. The faint hum of the refrigerator, the rhythmic sound of rain beginning to tap against the window, the way she absent-mindedly brushed her thumb against the rim of her glass. I found myself leaning in just a little without realizing it. Drawn not by anything she did, but by how safe it felt to be in that moment with her. Her laugh came soft and low when she noticed. "Careful," she teased. "You're starting to look too comfortable here." I grinned back because the truth was and there it was, a simple kitchen, a warm light, 2 people drinking something forgettable, and a tension so soft it didn't need to be named. This wasn't the kind of spark that explodes. This was the kind that quietly burns, slow, steady, and dangerously real. By the time the rain outside grew steady against the kitchen window, something about the air between us had changed. It wasn't playful anymore. Not entirely. There was still warmth, still that easy rhythm in our voices, but underneath it, something quieter had started to hum. She was sitting on the stool across from me, legs crossed, sweater hanging loose off one shoulder like it belonged there. Her hair, once perfectly pinned back, had a few strands falling across her cheek now. Soft, natural, beautiful in a way that didn't try to be. I'd known her for months, but I'd never seen her like this. Not just in her home, but at ease in it. And maybe for the first time I wasn't just looking at her. I was noticing her. She swirled her drink absent-mindedly, eyes tracing the rim of the glass. "I don't usually do this," she said quietly. "Do what?" I asked. She smiled softly. "Sit in a kitchen this late, drinking with someone who makes me feel like I'm 25 again." My laugh came out small and shaky. "You're making me sound a lot more interesting than I am." She shook her head, looking at me with that kind of honesty that strips away everything else. "You are. You just don't realize it." That sentence hung in the air longer than it should have. The hum of the refrigerator suddenly seemed louder. The space between us suddenly felt narrower. For a moment, she looked away, out toward the rain. There was something in her expression. Not regret, not hesitation exactly, more like she was trying to remember how to let herself feel this without fear. And I felt it too. That invisible line neither of us wanted to cross, but both of us had inched toward all night. I shifted slightly on my stool, close enough now that if she reached her hand across the counter, it would meet mine halfway. My pulse was a quiet drum in my ears. She exhaled slowly. "This is nice. I didn't expect to enjoy it this much." Her voice wasn't teasing anymore. It was soft, vulnerable in a way that made my chest tighten. "It is," I said quietly, and I meant it more than I wanted to admit. For a few seconds, neither of us spoke. We just sat there, Two people wrapped in a silence that didn't feel empty. Her eyes lifted back to mine, and this time, she didn't look away. There was a question in that look. Not a loud one. Not "Do you like me?" Or "What are we doing?" Just a quiet "Are you feeling this too?" I didn't need to answer it out loud. The slight lean forward. The way her fingers brushed against the edge of the counter, inching closer. The way neither of us flinched when the space between us thinned. That was enough. The rain fell harder outside, filling the silence with a soft rhythm. Her smile trembled slightly, not from fear, but from something real. And right there, in that small kitchen with the light humming above us, we both felt the weight of what was happening. Not a confession, not a decision, just the heat of a moment we weren't ready to name. We lingered in the kitchen longer than either of us planned. The drinks were nearly gone, but neither of us reached for our coats, our keys, or any excuse to end it. It wasn't because we had more to say. It was because neither of us wanted to break the silence. Eventually, she rose from her stool with a quiet exhale, pressing her palm against the counter like she needed to steady herself from something heavier than alcohol. She gave me a small, soft smile, the kind that doesn't just live on the lips, but travels to the eyes. "I should let you go," she said gently, though her voice didn't sound like someone who wanted to. "Yeah," I breathed out, even though I didn't want to leave either. She walked ahead of me toward the door, the soft rhythm of her bare feet against the hardwood floor filling the quiet. The rain outside had softened into a light drizzle, tapping softly against the windows. The house felt smaller now, not in a suffocating way, but in the way quiet moments sometimes pull everything closer. When we reached the doorway, she stopped. I almost bumped into her. The porch light spilled a soft amber glow across the front hall, casting warm shadows on her skin. She turned around slowly to face me, and for a second we didn't speak. We just looked at each other. There was a stillness in her eyes I hadn't seen before. Not playful, not teasing. This was something raw. A quiet truth pressing against the edges of her composure. She drew in a breath, as if steadying herself, and whispered, "You made me feel something I haven't felt in a long time." Her words hit harder than I expected. It wasn't a line. It wasn't meant to charm. It was real. I didn't know what to say, so I didn't. I just stepped forward, not too close, but close enough that our breaths met in the small space between us. She kept her hand on the doorframe, like it was the only thing keeping her steady. My hand rested on the railing beside us, and in that narrow gap between her fingers and mine, there was a question neither of us dared to fully ask. I could feel the warmth from her skin, not touching, just close enough that it was felt. That kind of closeness that doesn't scream. It hums. Her eyes flicked down just for a heartbeat, to where our hands almost touched, then back to mine. She wasn't hiding anymore. "I don't know what this is," she said softly, "but I don't want to pretend I don't feel it." The rain whispered outside. My pulse was loud in my chest. For a moment, I almost closed the distance. But I didn't. Not yet. Instead, I let my hand brush lightly against hers. A touch that lingered just enough to leave everything unsaid, yet understood. She didn't move away. She breathed into it. We stayed there like that. Two people standing in the doorway, not ready to say goodbye, not ready to cross the line either. Just breathing in the same quiet. And somehow, that silence said more than any confession could. The doorway felt like a line neither of us knew how to cross. The rain had softened into a quiet drizzle outside, and the porch light painted her in gold. For a moment, the world narrowed down to the space between us. No noise, no neighbors, no clock ticking somewhere in the background. Just the kind of silence that only happens when two people know something has shifted, and can't quite name it yet. She still had one hand on the doorframe, fingers curled slightly, as if holding herself steady. I stood just a breath away, my hand resting against the railing. It would have taken almost nothing to close the distance. A lean forward, a whisper, a risk. Her eyes lingered on me, soft and searching, like she was memorizing the way I looked in that exact second. It wasn't about lust. It wasn't even about romance in the loud, movie scene way. It was something quieter, deeper. She drew in a breath, A quiet, steady inhale, then smiled, the kind of smile that reaches past skin. "Thank you," she said softly. I tilted my head. "For what?" "For being here," she whispered. "For making me feel like I'm allowed to feel something again." Her words landed somewhere deep in my chest. I wasn't sure if I was supposed to respond. Maybe I didn't have to. Some words aren't meant to be answered, just held. Then, without warning, she stepped closer. Not rushed, not uncertain, just sure enough to make it feel deliberate. She reached up, her hand light against my arm, and leaned in. The kiss wasn't on my lips. It was on my cheek. Soft, slow, intentional. It didn't need to be anything more. Her breath lingered against my skin for a heartbeat after she pulled back. And that single heartbeat said everything neither of us had dared to say. I felt my chest rise as if the night had been holding its breath with me. She smiled again, smaller this time, quieter. "Good night," she whispered. I could have said 100 things in that moment. Something clever, something bold, something that could change the trajectory of everything. But instead, I just smiled, because sometimes silence is louder. "Good night," I echoed. I stepped back into the soft rain, feeling the cold droplets on my skin, but somehow, everything felt warmer. I glanced back once, just once, and saw her still standing at the door, one hand resting lightly against the frame, watching me go. She didn't close the door right away, and I didn't look away too quickly. It wasn't a goodbye. It was something else. A beginning whispered in a night too gentle to rush. As I walked away, I could still feel the warmth of her lips against my cheek. Faint, like a spark under the surface. It was enough. More than enough. Not a promise. Not a declaration. But something real. And sometimes, real doesn't need anything more than that. If this moment touched something in you, don't forget to like this video, leave a comment, and subscribe for more slow burn love stories. Every little click helps me keep telling these quiet, beautiful kinds of stories.